Imagine a quiet, serene park at sunset. A young black girl is sitting on a bench, enjoying the evening coolness and tranquility. Suddenly, this tranquility is disturbed by the appearance of a white policeman who comes too close. His intentions clearly unkind. He is sure that he can afford anything, not knowing that her father is the new police captain, a man who will not allow anyone to abuse his power. Friends, your support is incredibly important to us. Please write in the comments what your name is and what city you are watching this video from. Every comment and every view helps our channel to grow and find new viewers. You are our strength, and we are grateful to each of you for being with us. Enjoy the show. The warm evening slowly enveloped the parking calm, spilling over the old trees, the benches, and the long paths. A light breeze swayed the branches lazily, and it made it seem as if the whole world was subject to a special, measured rhythm, the rhythm of a city immersed in evening slumber. On one of the benches, in the shade of an old oak tree, sat a young girl. Her dark skin glowed softly in the light of the lanterns, and her long braids, gathered at the neck, lay almost motionless on her shoulders. She came here often, especially at times when the park was empty, and she could forget herself in this warm solitude. Her gaze was directed far away, to the path leading to the pond, on which the last glare of the passing day was playing. Her thoughts were far away, savoring every second of the silence so rare that she could be alone in the city. Always so noisy and restless, her breathing slowed and her shoulders relaxed, as if she were dissolving into the surrounding calm. But sometimes, even in the quietest and safest place, something disturbing could slip in, invisible to the eye, but felt somewhere on the edge of consciousness. The girl saw no one around her, but a sense of tension seemed to flicker through the air, subtle, almost invisible. She took a deep breath, taking in the sense of damp earth and cool air. When out of the corner of her eye she noticed movement. At first, it seemed random. Someone had decided to walk along the path, perhaps just past her, as it had happened many times before. But the stranger was in no hurry to leave. His footsteps were steady, a little heavy, and coming closer and closer. It was a man in a police uniform, lithe and tall. Suddenly, the stillness of the park was broken, and it seemed that even the warm air had become stale. He approached slowly, with a slight smile, but it was not a welcoming smile. It didn't carry the warmth or friendliness of someone just wanting to ask for the time or directions. There was something in his gaze that made the girl shrink, as if her inner space had suddenly begun to shrink, as if her inner world was becoming smaller and smaller under the cold, unfriendly gaze. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" he said, his voice sounding soft, but tinged with something strange. She nodded briefly, not saying a word, hoping he would take her silence as a signal to leave. But he took another step closer, very close, and now she could smell his cologne, acrid and heavy, too insistent. He was literally looming over her, his shadow obscuring the light from the street lamp as if on purpose, leaving her in a dark corner of the park. She tried to move away imperceptibly, but he stepped even closer, so that there was almost no space between them. His gaze slid over her face, as if assessing her not as a man, but as someone who saw her as a thing, a toy, not a living person. Fear was building inside her, but she tried not to give herself away, keeping her face calm and detached. "You know," he continued, "people like you don't come to this park very often. It's usually empty. It's dangerous, isn't it?" His words sounded like a warning, but not with the same tinge of concern, but with a coldness, as if he liked to say it. Her heart beat faster, a chill running down her spine. She wanted to get up, to leave, but something in his demeanor told her it wouldn't be that easy. The policeman did not avert his gaze. His eyes slid over the girl, scrutinizing her, as if she were something he had a right to scrutinize, as if her privacy and tranquility were nothing more than empty words. He stood too close, not allowing her to rise and step aside. The fear inside her grew stronger with each passing second, to a deafening, burning fear that increasingly robbed her of her ability to think straight. "How long have you been here alone?" His voice sounded mocking, and the look he gave her was full of hidden contempt. "Didn't think the likes of you might attract attention." Every word he said, every movement he made, seemed to cast a shadow over her, as if the very fact of her presence here was something wrong. She felt her heart pound harder as he took another half-step closer. Leaning over her, she could hear his heavy breathing, see the corner of his lips lift faintly as he watched her reaction intently. She squirmed on the bench, but didn't look away. grating her teeth to keep her fear at bay. He seemed to sense her fear, as if he were feeding on it, playing on her reactions. Mentally, she thought of where she could run if she stood up, but his figure completely blocked the way, and it would be impossible to get away unnoticed. You realize, his voice became quieter, almost intimate, that no one here can help you. The park is deserted at these hours, especially for people like you. She felt the anger rising inside, mingling with despair. His every look, his every word, seemed to eat away at her confidence. He spoke to her with such superiority, with that subtle, resentful tone that made it clear that in his eyes, she was nothing less important, less valuable. The policeman's gaze was becoming more and more inappropriate, with a disdain that easily turned to threat. She knew that any attempt to object or just stand up would only make things worse, but it was impossible to stay here, pretending as if everything was all right. The tension was building, like a taut stream ready to break at any moment. The policeman, arms crossed over his chest, straightened up and looked down at the girl with an expression that sent a chill down her spine. His posture, confident and haughty, betrayed that sense of superiority that was felt in every gesture, in every word. He was a representative of the law, a man in uniform, a symbol of power and control that was beyond her reach. That sense of inequality hung in the air like an unbearable weight that could not be shaken off. You know, he stretched out with a quiet, sarcastic sneer, the uniform gives me the right to be here and do whatever I see fit, especially with people like you around. He said the last word with emphasized contempt, as if her very presence here were a violation. His fingers carelessly touched the badge on his chest, as if to remind him that he had that badge of authority, not her. He knew this park was his territory, and here his word was law. Here he could decide who was right and who was wrong, who should leave and who had the right to stay. And he savored that feeling. If something happens, he added, grinning, who do you think they'll believe? The cop who protects this town, or the random girl, a black girl who doesn't know her place? His voice sounded cold, indifferent, as if he were stating a truism. He pronounced the word black with a special accent, deliberately, not just as a reference to her appearance, but as a label, a stigma, a reminder that she was an outsider in this city, in this society. It was as if her very belonging to this place and people was something unreliable, fragile, and unimportant. His gaze became even more unpleasant, filled with the kind of power that comes from a man who is sure of his inviolability. It was as if the uniform itself, his badge, even the tone of his voice, were designed to suppress people like her, to deny them the right to their own opinions, to safety, to a place in society. She felt rage and fear merging, but knew that any word she said, any movement, would only make him more sure of his rightness. Her inner protest, hot and desperate, clashed with the cold, heavy wall of his superiority, reinforced by power and racial prejudice. The policeman stepped forward, and his shadow covered the girl like an ominous cloud that obscured the last light of hope. In his eyes, full of disdain, there was more than contempt. It was a deep-rooted hatred that was not hidden behind the mask of the law. The girl felt fear clench in her chest, like a dark shadow ready to swallow her whole. You know it's not customary to be alone in this neighborhood, he said, his voice even more penetrating, as if tuning into her vulnerability. Especially if you're like you. He looked at her, as if he were searching her eyes for signs of fear, enjoying the fact that his words hurt. Every word he said hit her like cold blades, emphasizing her otherness. He spoke of it as if her skin color were not just a characteristic, but a flaw that had no place in their society. It wasn't just an insult, it was an assertion that she didn't belong here, that her presence only caused rejection and resentment. Do you really think any of the people who walk here would dare to interface? He went on, grinning wickedly. They don't care what happens to you. You know you're nothing more than a shadow in the park to them, and maybe even a problem that's best not to mess with. She felt her knees trembling and her breathing getting heavier and heavier. Every word he said, every disparaging remark, seemed to pull the last drops of confidence from her. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but fear bound her like invisible chains. She realized he was a cop, and even if she screamed, it would backfire on her. His power seemed limitless, and her place seemed insignificant. I could help you, he said, his tone sly, but his eyes remained cold. But you know there's a price to pay for everything. He leaned closer, his breath hot, and she felt panic rising in her. Anger raged inside her, mixed with horror. She couldn't understand how this man, who had the power to protect, could so easily use it against her. The whole situation was a confusing nightmare with no way out, and every time she tried to imagine how she could cope, another of his dismissive remarks plunged her back into darkness. She knew that his hatred of her skin color wasn't something new, it was something she'd heard before, encountering the disdain that hid behind the mask of friendliness. But now it was taking a sinister turn, and fear clutched at her heart, making her think that this evening could be the beginning of something terrible that would change her life forever. The girl sat on the bench, as if frowning in mute terror. Her thoughts swirled, each one a reminder of how vulnerable she was. The policeman leaning over her was the epitome of fear, and she felt as if she were trapped in a trap that she had fallen into completely by accident. The surroundings were empty, and there wasn't a single sound that could attract attention. This silence only added to her anxiety. She knew her voice had no power here. She tried to gather her thoughts, to realize what was happening, but fear clutched at her chest like an invisible trap. Every time she opened her mouth to say something, only the words she knew flashed through her mind. They were useless. They could only make her worse. What right do I have to speak? She thought. The policeman was too strong, too sure of his impunity. He seemed to enjoy her silence, and it only added fuel to the fire of her despair. His smirk of contempt suggested that he enjoyed seeing her weakness. The girl felt anger overwhelm her, but it merged with her despair, preventing her from acting. Her voice, once so confident, now faded somewhere deep inside her. She wanted to scream, to run away, to do anything to get rid of this heavy atmosphere, but fear held her in place. She realized that any wrong move could lead to unpredictable consequences. Moment by moment, the policeman leaned closer and closer, his eyes glittering as if a fire of hatred burned in them, and that fire flared up, consuming her. Suddenly she remembered how she had always heard stories of similar situations, of girls who were never rescued, of those who kept silent for fear of not being believed. Those stories seemed too real to her now, too close, and she knew that she herself had been among them. The thought was a burden she couldn't shake off. Her heart raced even faster, and she wanted to go back to a time when everything had been simple and peaceful, when the evening in the park hadn't been marred by fear and threats. But now, sitting there, shrinking with anxiety, she felt disconnected from reality, as if she were in a nightmare that would never end. She inhaled deeply, trying to calm herself down, but each breath became more and more difficult. Despair flared inside her, and she realized she couldn't stay here any longer. But how could she leave when the only road to freedom was blocked by the man who had a duty to protect her? The policeman, feeling his grip on the situation strengthen, sat her down on the edge of the bench, continuing to lean toward the girl with a smirk full of smugness. His voice became even more cruel, like a knife point that was stabbing into her heart. "Do you really think any of your friends or parents would believe you?" he said, looking at her with disdain. "I'm a cop. I have friends and co-workers who will support me, and you're just a girl who should stay away from places like this." His words sounded like a sentence, emphasizing that to him she was just another problem, someone to play with, to manipulate, who had no voice or significance. Her silence only fueled his confidence. "If you decide to go to the station, I assure you," he leaned closer, his breath hot and luscious, "anything you say will be rejected. They'll say you're just trying to make excuses for coming to this park alone. Who would pay attention to a black girl with a little problem?" His words filled the air with hatred, and she felt a wave of anger and disgust rise inside her. He laughed, his laughter sounding like a mockery of everything she represented, of who she was. He had a knack for pinpointing her vulnerabilities, and every remark he made was a tip-off that her pain and fear were indifferent to him. "You need to know your place," he said, leaning back and folding his arms across his chest. "I'm the one who decides what's right and what's wrong, and you need to remember that your words will never mean as much as mine. I am the law in this park." The girl felt her heart pounding faster and faster, and fear filled her mind. She looked for ways to get away, but her thoughts tangled like a spider's web. She wanted to say something back, to defend herself, but his threat overrode all her attempts. The policeman leaned toward her again, the grim whisper in his voice again. "You don't want me to tell my coworkers that you provoked me, do you? Say you just wanted attention." He grinned, as if enjoying his power, and that grin was tearing her apart. "You know what they'll think when they see you with a cop, don't you?" Every word he spoke turned into icy arrows that pierced her soul. She felt her whole life shrinking before this terrible encounter, when her fear became a living thing and she didn't know how to defeat it. He realized her world was crumbling, and that was his goal to rob her of her voice, to snuff out the spark of hope, leaving only hopelessness. "Remember," he said with a cold smile, "no one can help you. You have no one. I'm the only one who matters here. You're not here to protect anyone. You're just another shadow in the park, and no one will notice you." The girl sat there, her thoughts racing, and she was immersed in memories that made her heart clench with pain. In every word of the policeman, she heard echoes of the many stories that had been told in her family, at school, on the street. Like a heavy weight, they were weighing on her mind, flooding her with hopelessness and fear. She recalled hearing a few months ago about how a black girl she knew had been arrested for a minor offense, just for walking by. She was called out by the police and was followed by insults, taunts, and force. The words criminal and threat echoed in her head like a sentence that left the girl with permanent trauma. The contemptuous glances, the deprivation of her voice, all of this affected her, and she was still unable to recover. The girl felt a chill run through her body as she thought back to other cases that had been talked about in classes at school, about people who had been arrested merely for walking down the street instead of being in the right place at the right time, about black men who were accused of crimes they didn't commit, people who never saw justice. Some of them were never believed, ran through her head, and she suddenly realized that she could have been the next in this long chain of injustice. As if reliving all these events, she realized that the policeman in front of her was the embodiment of a system that knew no compassion. It was a system designed to suppress, not protect. She couldn't get rid of the thought that society looked at her and others like her with contempt, that their lives had no value. There were whispers and looks of distrust around her, and she seemed to be isolated like a cage. Every word he said, every prejudicial remark made her feel even more vulnerable. She knew that this wasn't just a one-person encounter, but a reflection of how society looked at people of her color. For the first time in her life, she felt those fears and prejudices clenching around her like snakes ready to strike. "You do realize you're only making things worse," the policeman said, and his voice interrupted her thoughts again, as if her thoughts were irrelevant and her fear a mere whim. "If you don't learn to behave properly, all those stories about those who suffer could be yours." She felt the lump in her throat grow unbearably heavy. There was no sympathy in his words, only cold threat, as if he knew that her past, her fears and pain were something he could control. The girl understood that this system did not want change. It was set up to protect only those at the top of the hierarchy. With each passing minute, the pressure of society, its expectations and biases, became more intolerable, and she felt that she was losing not only her confidence but herself. She wanted to scream, to break the silence, but fear was overwhelming her again. The minute she realized the hopelessness of her situation, her heart filled with a burning desire to escape from this hell. But how? How could she escape from what was already written into her destiny? At the peak of her despair, when everything around her seemed bleak and hopeless, the girl suddenly felt a spark ignite inside her. The spark was weak, but bright enough to dispel the darkness that surrounded her. In that moment, as the policeman continued to intimidate her, she realized she needed to stand up for herself, despite the fear and prejudice she faced. "I will not be silent," she said, and her voice, oh shaky, sounded much more confident than she had expected. Every word was filled with determination, as if she couldn't believe what she was saying. There was a growing feeling inside her that her rights mattered, that she had a right to a defense and a voice, despite all the biases that surrounded her. The policeman didn't seem to have expected such a reaction. His smirk frowned on his face, and he leaned even closer, trying to suppress her voice. But she wasn't going to give up. She remembered all the stories she'd heard about the brave women, the ones who raised their voices against the system, and it gave her strength. "I'm not alone," she thought. In every word she spoke, she felt the support of everyone who had ever suffered injustice. "You have no right to threaten me," she said, no longer afraid of his gaze. "I have a right to be here. I have a right to be protected, and I won't let you intimidate me." The words rushed out of her like a stream that refreshed her soul. She felt anger rise in her chest, but it wasn't just anger at him, it was anger at the whole system that was trying to break her. At that moment, her fear began to dissipate, giving way to determination. "If you think you can do anything to me just because you're in uniform, "You're sorely mistaken. I'm not going to let prejudice and hatred destroy me," she said, feeling the strength in her voice. The policeman, realizing that her confidence was growing, suddenly became less aggressive. Confusion flashed in his eyes, and she saw him bite his lips several times, choosing his words. The girl continued, not giving him a chance to interrupt her. "I know you think I'm weak, but I won't keep quiet. I will tell what you did, and there will be consequences. I'm not alone, and there are many people who will support me. I can't take this attitude anymore." Those words were like a sword she was thrusting into his confidence, and suddenly a tension hung in there. The girl felt a strength growing inside her, a sense that she wasn't just a victim, but a person entitled to her truth. She wasn't going to be the one to let fear rule her. The policeman frowned for a moment, and her determination caused him to look away. He seemed unsure how to react to her words. The girl looked at him, realizing that in this moment, her life could change, not only hers, but others who face similar injustice. She knew that now was her chance to break out of the dark circle of fear and become a voice for those who were too scared to speak. She stood on the edge, and in that moment she felt stronger than ever. This was her time, and she was determined that she would not let anyone take that strength away from her. Because of her boldness and confidence, the policeman seemed to explode with anger. He had not expected his victim to respond so confidently, and it only fueled his aggression. Something sinister flashed in his eyes, and he suddenly stood up, as if about to demonstrate who was really in charge. "You regret what you said?" he said with a sullen grin, his voice like the whisper of a predator about to strike. He stepped closer, violating her personal space, making her feel even more vulnerable. Every step he took filled the air with tension, and she felt her heart race. "You have no right to touch me," she screamed, but ignoring him only made her more afraid. She took a step backward, pressing herself against the bench, but it didn't stop, coming closer and closer. "Right," he laughed scornfully, as if her words were just a joke. "What do you know about rights? You have no rights while I'm here. I decide what's right and what's wrong, and you need to understand that." She could feel the cold sweat running down her back, and she wanted to run away, but fear shackled her. His threats were becoming explicit, and it didn't seem intent on stopping. She tried to suppress the fear, but it was too strong, like a wave crashing against the shore. Suddenly the policeman stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. He squeezed it so hard that she felt the pain seep into every cell of her body. She groaned in surprise, and tears glistened in her eyes, not from the pain, but from the horrible reality that she couldn't do anything about it. "Let me go," she shouted, trying to break free, but he only grinned, his grip growing stronger. "Why, you provoked it, didn't you?" His voice became grim and sullen, and his eyes burned with merciless contempt. "You don't know who you're messing with." She knew his actions were out of line, but fear paralyzed her. Her mind screamed that this was wrong, that she should resist, but the fear he instilled in her soul seemed to shackle her, turning her into a statue. He began to lean closer, and she felt his breath on her face, filled not only with hatred, but with lust for power. "I like you," he said, his voice threatening. "You need to know who's in charge. You think you can speak your mind, but I'll show you what happens to people who don't know their place." There was something so terrible in his words that the girl felt the world around her begin to blur. Every word he said cut like a knife, and with each passing second, fear clutched her in its grip. She knew she had to do something, had to break out of this trap, but how? She couldn't just sit back and let him do whatever he wanted to her. A fire flared in her heart, and she remembered her resolve. She wasn't alone. She thought of others who had faced similar things. This moment wasn't just about her, it was an opportunity to protest the whole system. Gathering the last of her strength, the girl uttered with fury, "I won't let you do this. I'm not afraid of you." At that moment, she felt a spark of hope rekindle inside her. This was her last attempt to assert her rights and show that she was not a victim, but a fighter for her freedom. But the policeman only grinned in response, and she could see in his gaze that he would do anything to intimidate her even more. But now she knew that her fear could not break her resolve, and she would fight for her truth to the end. Gathering her courage, the girl tried to use every drop of confidence that was still left in her. She realized that in this situation, every word mattered, and it was necessary to use even a hint of her surroundings to divert the policeman's attention from his aggressive intentions. "You know," she began, trying to speak calmly, though her heart was pounding like a hammer, I have powerful relatives who will not tolerate such behavior from anyone, much less a police officers." The policeman grinned at her, his face expressing doubt and contempt. He didn't take her words seriously. Instead, he leaned closer, something threatening glinting in his eyes. "Influential relatives," he said it with obvious disdain, as if it were a joke. "You probably think you can get away with saying you have connections, don't you?" He took a step back to look at her with more mockery, and the moment pressed on her like a stone. She felt his gaze pierce her, and an involuntary shiver ran down her spine. "Who are they?" "Your influential relatives. Some uncle who works in management, or maybe your daddy who tells everyone how lucky he is to have a job." His words were drenched in venom, and she realized he wasn't taking her seriously at all. His laughter was contemptuous, as if he'd open her eyes to her ridiculous ambitions. He stepped closer again, coming menacingly closer to her face. "Come on, tell me who they are. Maybe I should remind them that you don't know how to behave with the police," he said, and there was nothing but threat and hatred in his tone. Her heart clenched with fear. She felt that his words were not only humiliating her, but also trying to break her spirit. However, the same spark flared up inside her again. She knew that her words might seem insignificant to him, but she wasn't going to give up. "You may laugh, but I have a father who just became a police captain," she said, trying to put all the determination she could into her words. Her voice sounded firm. Despite her inner turmoil, she couldn't believe she'd said those words herself. But now she had hope. She knew her father wouldn't let it go unheeded. The policeman frowned, and his grin disappeared for a moment, but soon he laughed again, looking at her as if she had told the funniest joke. "Oh, the captain, you say? What, you think he's gonna call me and say, 'Don't touch my daughter'? I highly doubt it. I'm in uniform, and you're just a little girl trying to convince me she can make a difference." She felt his words pull her back into the abyss of fear, but at the same time, anger flared within her. He didn't realize who he was dealing with. She wasn't just a tiny little girl. She was the daughter of a man who had dedicated his life to fighting for justice, and she knew he wouldn't let that go unchallenged. "You don't realize who you're dealing with," she said, feeling the anger and confidence overwhelm her. "My father won't turn a blind eye to your behavior. He won't let you humiliate me." Her words filled the space between them like a challenge, and she could feel her resolve growing stronger. The policeman, though he continued to laugh, became less cocky. She saw the shadow of doubt flicker in his eyes, and it gave her strength. She could feel the tension building around her, and knew she had no right to give in. Even if his laughter sounded evil, she wouldn't let it douse the spark that was already burning inside. Every response she made wasn't just an attempt to defend herself, it was a cry for justice that couldn't go unnoticed. "I know you think you're in control," she said, "but trust me, you can't escape the consequences of your actions. Soon, everyone will know what you've done, and you regret it." As if blowing up the barriers of fear, the girl felt like she was finally back in control. At that moment, she realized that right now she had a chance to resist the system that was trying to break her. As the tension between the girl and the policeman was building, a passerby suddenly appeared from behind the trees. He was middle-aged, with a facial expression that betrayed his curiosity and confusion when he noticed what was happening. His eyes met the girl's for a moment, and she felt hope spark inside her. Maybe this man could help her. However, the policeman, noticing the stranger, quickly changed his demeanor, turning in his direction with hateful disdain. "Hey, you," he shouted, his voice sounding menacing and commanding. "Get out! You don't need to interface with what's going on here." The passerby hesitated and stopped, not knowing what to do. He understood that a uniformed policeman was a symbol of authority, but the look on the girl's face and her desperate eyes made him hesitate. Fury boiled in his heart as he realized what was happening, but he also realized that he had no authority to intervene. He began, but the policeman interrupted him, his voice filled with prejudice comments. "You damn passerby, you don't know who you're dealing with," he said, unleashing all his anger on the stranger. "Do you really think this girl matters? She's just another one of those trying to cause trouble. Get out before I arrest you for disorderly conduct." His words were full of disdain, and the girl felt herself becoming even more afraid. She knew he was using his power to intimidate the stranger, and it emphasized all the hatred he felt. Every comment was laced with racism and oppression, as if he was trying to put her back where she belonged. The passerby, realizing that the policeman was out of his mind, began to hesitate. He saw the girl's hand clench and felt her fear. But on the other hand, he feared for his own safety. A struggle flashed in his eyes to stand up for himself or to stay back, avoiding possible consequences. "I'm not going to leave," he said, his voice sounding determined. "I can see that something terrible is going on here. You have no right to treat her like this." The policeman grinned, his eyes glittering with contempt. "Look, I have the authority. I can arrest you just for standing here," he said, as if enjoying his superiority. "You really think your white privilege is going to help you in this situation? Get your ass out of here before you regret it." Every word he said sounded like a threat, and the stranger frowned, realizing that confronting the police was a risk that could backfire not only on him, but on the girl as well. He looked around, and his heart filled with anger and helplessness. How could he stand by when there was a clear injustice happening in front of him? "You have no right to touch her," he shouted, feeling his anger overwhelm him. But the policeman only laughed, his mockery sounding as if he saw this case as an opportunity to show who was the real boss. "Exactly," he said with a smirk. "You're nothing in this situation. You're just a lookout who wants to play the hero. Forget that you have privileges. They won't help you when it comes to real power." The girl felt all her hopes begin to melt away when she heard those words. She knew that the policeman could easily use his power against the stranger, and the thought overwhelmed her. But still, in the back of her mind, she had a spark of hope that someone would stand up for her. "Stop it," the stranger spoke again, his voice not as confident as it had been at first. "This is wrong, and I'm not going to let it go. I'm not just going to let you abuse your power." The policeman, feeling his authority begin to falter under the pressure, only grinned back, his face contorted with contempt. "You're too smart for your own good. Get out before I call for backup. Make sure you have room to run, because you can't just walk away from me." At that moment, the girl realized that her chances of escape were growing. The stranger, despite the fear and oppression, was still here, and that gave her hope. She knew that now, with the tension hanging in the air, she needed to act. The fire inside her flared up again, and she realized that together they could stand up to a police officers who used his power to abuse and intimidate. The situation was escalating, and the pressure seemed to have reached its limit. The policeman, sensing that his power was beginning to wane, continued to stubbornly try to intimidate both the girl and the stranger. But at this point, the girl realized that she needed to let the policeman know who he was dealing with. "You know what?" she said, her voice sounding firmly determined despite the trembling in her hands. "You really don't know who you're talking to. My father is the new police captain, and he won't let your actions go unchecked." The girl's words pierced the air, and the moment stood still. The policeman, at first laughing, suddenly frowned in place. His confidence began to crack as he realized the seriousness of her statement. "What?" he said with obvious disbelief, and his tone became less confident. "You've got to be kidding. How can someone like you be the daughter of a police captain?" The girl, sensing his hesitation, continued on, not letting fear take over. "I'm not kidding. My dad just got promoted, and he's gonna deal with you if you don't stop." The policeman began to look around nervously, as if he feared that someone might appear to confirm her words. His earlier mockery gave way to confusion, and he finally realized that his actions could have serious consequences. "It can't be true," he mumbled, avoiding the gaze of the girl and the passerby. His confidence was fading before his eyes, and fear settled in his heart instead. "You realize I'm in shape," he continued, trying to regain control. "I could do anything, and no one would believe you. Even if you told your father, they wouldn't believe him." But no matter how much he tried to make his words sound confident, his voice no longer sounded so menacing. He already knew that there was a risk in his actions. It was as if at that moment, he suddenly realized that there might be a powerful force behind his actions, ready to confront him. A passerby, sensing that the atmosphere was beginning to change, said, "If it's true, I'll back her up. I'm prepared to confirm that I witnessed your behavior. You might want to think about the consequences." The girl felt her heart fill with hope. This stranger was standing behind her, and that gave her strength. The policeman, seeing the determination in the girl's eyes and the support of the passerby, started to back up. His confidence seemed to crumble, and he took a step back, looking at the girl in disgust. "I'm not going to mess with that," he said, and his voice was no longer in the same haughty tone. "You have to leave," she added, feeling like she was in control now. "I'll make sure this gets out. You won't be able to do what you want anymore." The policeman, realizing that his threat was no longer working, began to back away slowly. He cast one last warning glance at them, but it no longer had the confidence with which he had come. "You'll answer for this," he said, already unsure. But it didn't matter anymore. The girl knew that her words and those of the passerby could have an impact. The policeman, realizing that his actions could end in serious consequences, quickly turned around and, clearly confused, walked away. The girl and the stranger exchanged glances full of relief and victory. Finally, they were able to win. She knew that her father, as the new police captain, would be able to investigate the incident and get justice. "Thank you for intervening," she said, turning to the passerby. "I couldn't stay away," he replied, his voice sounding confident. "We have to support each other, especially at times like this." With each passing moment as the policeman left the park, the girl realized that this wasn't just her personal triumph. It was a testament to the strength and determination that can awaken even in the most difficult of situations. She knew there would be more struggles ahead, but with this experience under her belt, she felt that she now had the ability to defend herself and others from injustice. The policeman, moving away from the scene, felt his anger intertwined with fear. His every movement became abrupt and nervous, and his mind raged like a storm, leaving no room for calm. His pride, which had habitually placed him on a pedestal of power, now seemed to be bursting at the seams. He already knew that his actions could have serious consequences, but his racial prejudice and inner superiority mentality did not allow him to back down. A rage was building inside him. How could this black girl dare to defy him? He was a policeman and she was just a teenager. As he paced the park, his mind filled with thoughts of what he had to do to regain control. He needed to steer himself away from the thought that his subordinates might find out about his disgrace. He couldn't let anyone question his authority. She just wanted attention, he muttered to himself, assuring himself that her claim of being the captain's daughter was just a fabrication. No action will be taken against me because no one will believe this girl. But in the back of his mind, he knew they weren't just words. The very thought that this girl could be the new captain's daughter brought a cold sweat to his face. Images of co-workers and other police officers who could support her if she decided to go forward with the story surfaced in his mind. An uneasy feeling came over his heart that his impunity was now threatened. The look on the face of the stranger who had intervened emphasized his helplessness. No matter how much he tried to put this situation aside, reality remained an integral part of his life. "I won't let them take my power away from me," he said, clenching his fists. His bias made him hate anyone who could threaten his authority. He couldn't let this black girl, or even a stranger, ruin what he thought was his right. His inner anger was beginning to turn into rage. He remembered his colleagues, who were always ready to support him, and it gave him new strength. "I'll handle this situation myself," he decided, inhaling deeply to calm himself, but the storm continued to rage inside him. Like an oath, he uttered, "I'm gonna make her regret what she did. It's just a matter of time." As he walked back to his patrol car, he felt the power of the uniform fill him again. He was a policeman again, not just a disgraced man. Getting behind the wheel, he began to consider his next steps. "I'll find a way to shut her up. If she thinks she has a father captain, she's sorely mistaken. I will not allow her to continue to threaten my authority." Hatred boiled inside him, but he also realized that this hatred had to be directed carefully. He needed to act in a way that would not raise additional suspicion, but at the same time not give her a chance to win. He knew he needed to create an environment where she couldn't get support and his bias would dominate again. "Maybe I should talk to my coworkers," he pondered as he made his way back to the station. "They'll realize that this girl is just another problem, trying to make a fuss over nothing." Anger and fear struggled inside him, but one fact was undeniable. He couldn't let this situation get out of hand. He was preparing for a battle in which he was putting not only his pride, but also his power on the line, and he wasn't going to back down, despite the obvious threats coming from the girl and her stranger. Time was working for him, and he was going to use it wisely. Plans were already brewing in his mind for how to turn things around, so that his power would remain unchallenged. He simply could not be defeated by anyone who dared to challenge his power. As the sun began to set over the horizon, coloring the sky pink and orange, the girl's father, a police captain, drove up to the park. Feeling slightly uneasy, he had just finished his workday, and after hearing about the strange situation that had happened to his daughter, he couldn't leave her alone. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the familiar bench where she usually spent time. But as soon as he entered the park, his gaze fell on the scene unfolding before him. His daughter was standing in the center, clasping her hands together, and a policeman was nearby, looking very tense. The father instantly sensed that something was wrong. He saw the policeman straighten up as his eyes met his gaze, and at the same moment, his heart sank. "What's going on here?" the captain said, approaching them with a determined stride. His voice sounded confident, and there was no hint of doubt in it. The policeman, realizing that the situation was out of control, quickly tried to regain his confidence, but fear and anger were already intertwined inside him. He knew that the police captain was a man no one would dare ignore, especially now that his daughter was in that park. "It's just a misunderstanding, Captain," he began, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. "I was just doing a standard inspection." A standard checkup? The captain looked around at his colleague, then looked at his daughter again, noticing how she was trembling. "I don't see that there's any standard here." The girl stood still, her eyes glistening with tears, and she seemed to be struggling to hold back her emotions. The father, seeing her condition, felt a rage flaring up inside him. He realized that his daughter was facing a horror and this was unacceptable. "Get out of here," the captain said, pointing at the policeman. His voice was as cold as ice. "I'm not going to let you treat my daughter like that." The policeman, not knowing how to react, hesitated, his thoughts racing for a way out. His pride and racial prejudice collided with reality, the fact that he was facing a new police captain who could ruin his career with a single word. "Look, Captain," I began, but the captain interrupted him. "No excuses. You know what you did, and if you think I'm going to let you get away with it with impunity, you're sorely mistaken." The policeman felt his confidence begin to melt like snow in the sun. He could not believe that he was in a situation where his status no longer gave him an advantage. A feeling of despair was growing inside him, and he didn't know how to get out of it. "I was just doing my duty," he continued, but his words sounded unconvincing, even to himself. The captain walked slowly toward him, his eyes sparkling with anger. This policeman, using his position of authority, had stumbled over his limit. "You have no right to punish anyone using your power," said the captain, his voice loud and clear, resonating in the empty part. The policeman, realizing that the captain was not going to back down, stepped back. Fear filled his heart, and he began to realize that his actions could have serious consequences. The girl looked at her father with hope. She felt that everything would change now. She knew that her father had always fought for justice and was ready to confront anyone who disregarded her rights. "I will investigate this incident," the captain continued, turning to the policeman, "and I will make sure that all your actions are checked." The policeman frowned, realizing that he was now in his most vulnerable position. His own biases and abuses of power now turned against him, and he knew that none of his excuses would be taken seriously. The captain turned to his daughter, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her close, as if protecting her from the world. She felt his strength transfer to her, and it filled her with hope. "It's going to be okay," he said quietly, looking into her eyes. "I'm here, and I'll take care of you." From behind them, they could hear the policeman finally backing away, his face contorted with anger and despair. He couldn't believe that his impunity had been so easily shattered. Now, as darkness began to envelop the park, the captain and his daughter stood together, determined and hopeful. They knew their fight was not over, but now they had a plan and the power to get justice. The policeman standing in front of them was a symbol of what they were about to fight, and that fight was just beginning. The police captain, hiding his daughter, felt his rage being replaced by a cold, calculating anger. He turned to the policeman, who seemed to be on the verge of panic. "Explain what happened here," he said, his voice sounding as if every word had been honed and hardened like steel. The policeman, realizing that his only task now was to justify himself, began to speak, but his words sounded unconvincing. "I was just doing a standard inspection, Captain," he began, trying to hide his true motives. "That girl, she looked suspicious." The captain raised an eyebrow incredulously. "Suspicious? You mean she was just sitting on the bench?" "I don't see anything suspicious. She's a teenager just enjoying the evening." The policeman rubbed the back of his head nervously, trying to find the right words, but only got more and more confused. May have been a little out of line, but I have instincts. You know how it is, Captain, he continued, trying to justify his actions. Sometimes you have to take precautions. The captain crossed his arms over his chest, feeling his rage begin to flare again. Precautions? Are you trying to say that your actions were justified because of her skin color? His voice sounded harsh and ruthless. Are you serious? The policeman swallowed, feeling his confidence melt away. He realized that his racist motives might have been the reason for his downfall. No, Captain, that's not what I meant. He tried to explain, but the captain wasn't going to listen. Don't you realize that you've jeopardized not only your career, but the entire police force? Said the captain, his face stony. How dare you treat her like that? She has a right to safety, and as a police officer you have a duty to protect her, not threaten her. The captain paced toward the policeman, his anger building with each word. You think your uniform protects you from consequences? You're wrong. I will report your every offense. Your actions were completely unacceptable. The policeman, realizing the gravity of the situation, tried to draw the captain's attention to other factors. But I had a reason. I have experience. Captain, you know how dangerous it can be here, especially with young men. I couldn't just ignore her. The captain exploded. Dangerous? That's your excuse. You have no right to put everyone in the same category. You should have acted according to protocol, not let your preconceived notions drive your actions. The policeman, feeling cornered, tried to find a way out. I was just doing my job, he repeated, but he no longer believed in his words. Your job is to protect people, not threaten them, the captain bellowed, his voice rolling through the park like thunder. You should know that the whole system is against you now. I'll do everything I can to get you suspended. The captain, no longer able to contain his rage, walked to his car and pulled out his cell phone. He knew he had to report the incident immediately and demand an investigation. The policeman stood with his head down, feeling his world crumble. He realized that everything he had tried to hide was now exposed, and he was on the verge of losing everything he had. I will not let your actions overshadow my daughter and ruin her life, the captain said, glaring at the cop with contempt. I'll make sure everyone knows about your behavior. The policeman, realizing he had no excuses left, finally fell silent, and with each passing moment, he realized how badly he had set himself up. Thoughts raged in his head, but nothing could change what had happened. The captain, feeling a surge of determination, turned to his daughter. Are you okay, sweetheart? She nodded, though her eyes were full of fear. Now that I'm here, you're safe, he said confidently, taking her hand. We'll get through this together. The policeman stood there, immersed in his thoughts, realizing that his former life had come to an end, and all his actions, based on bias and racism, would now turn against him. His fear, in turn, was all too real, and he didn't know how to deal with it. The captain and his daughter turned around, and in that moment they were determined. They knew they had a fight for justice ahead of them, and this was only the beginning of their journey to restore justice. But now they were not alone. The captain stood before the policeman like a rod of justice, ready to bring down the full force of his power upon the one who had so ruthlessly abused it. Fire burned in his eyes, and every word he spoke was charged with anger and determination. You don't understand what justice is, he said, his voice as menacing as thunder. You use your uniform to bully and humiliate an innocent girl, and it will not go unpunished. The policeman, immersed in his thoughts about the possible consequences, felt his confidence crumble. He tried to justify himself, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He knew that his actions were not just a mistake, but a manifestation of the racism that was deeply rooted in his perception of the world. You seem to forget that you serve the community, not your own racial biases, the captain continued, his eyes glittering with rage. You act as if you have the right to decide who is worthy of respect and who is not, based on skin color. It's not just shameful, it's a crime. The policeman tried to stand up for himself, but there was no longer the same confidence in his voice. But I have had experience, he insisted, but the captain only grinned, realizing that these words could not save him. Experience. Your experience is just an excuse for your racist actions. You have to realize that racism and violence are not just words. They are real issues that ruin lives. The captain, feeling his anger turn to determination, continued, "How can you look your coworkers in the eye knowing that you have betrayed them, betrayed your uniform and everything they stand for? You have no idea what it's like to live in fear, when every day your skin color becomes your sentence." The policeman frowned, realizing the gravity of the situation. The captain continued to emphasize, "Every action you take will be evaluated. You think you're safe because you wear a uniform. You're wrong. It's just a uniform, and it won't protect you from the consequences when justice is served." The captain took a step closer, and the policeman couldn't help but back away, realizing that this man standing before him was not just his superior, but the father of the very girl he was trying to intimidate. "I will fight for her, and if you think your racist views and violence will pass muster, you are sorely mistaken," the captain said, his voice growing more determined. "You have committed a crime, and now I will do everything in my power to make your actions public." There wasn't an ounce of doubt in his eyes. He knew he had to act to protect his daughter and restore her confidence in a world that was not always kind. The policeman, feeling the weight of his responsibility, tried to say something else, but his words only vanished into thin air, leaving no trace. "I can't let you threaten anyone else," the captain continued, his voice sounding like thunder in the silence. "I'm going to tell the entire department what happened here, and I'm going to do everything I can to get you removed from the service." The captain knew they had a long journey ahead of them. He could see how the fear and oppression his daughter had endured had left its mark on her. He had to restore her faith in justice, even if it meant facing his own colleagues who might not understand his decisions. "I'm not only your boss, I'm also this girl's father," he said, his voice quieter, but every letter sounded like a threat. "You hurt her, and I won't let it go unpunished." The policeman lowered his eyes, realizing that he could not win this battle. His thoughts about racism and violence had become his own prison. He knew that his actions had not just affected one life, they had affected an entire community. The captain, feeling that his fight for justice was just beginning, looked at his daughter. He knew that now together they must overcome all the difficulties that stood in their way, and perhaps this moment was the starting point for the changes that were so necessary in their society. Both father and daughter stood together, ready to fight the bias and injustice that was so deeply rooted in their world. With each passing moment, their resolve only grew stronger, and they knew their voice would be heard. Justice must prevail. The moment the captain finished his speech, the policeman felt the world around him begin to crumble. It was as if a click went off in his mind, and he realized that his former sense of impunity, which he had nurtured for so long, was no longer valid. Every action he had taken, every derogatory comment he had made was now a curse, and he was on the edge of a precipice. That policeman, feeling his knees begin to buckle, tried to get to his feet, but thoughts of the consequences of his actions swept over him like a cloud. His head rattled. He had always believed that the uniform would protect him. He never thought that one day his coworkers might turn against him, especially now that his actions were being discussed. He couldn't ignore the fact that things were different now, and he was more vulnerable than ever before. "You can't just walk away from this," the captain said, as if reading his mind. "Every policeman must realize his responsibility. We're supposed to protect people, not persecute them. You broke that oath, and now you're in serious trouble." That policeman, still struggling to find words, felt panic overwhelm him. He realized that his colleagues, who may have supported him before, would now look at him differently, not as a defender of order, but as a racist and a rapist. He had always looked at others who tried to achieve justice as weaklings. Now he was in their position. His own actions had led to his downfall. "I didn't mean for it to come to this," he mumbled, though he couldn't believe what he was saying. Deep down, he knew that all of this was more than just an unwanted incident. It was abuse, and he could no longer hide his racist biases. "Didn't want to," the captain repeated, his voice cold and determined. "Your intentions don't matter when you make someone feel vulnerable and scared. That's exactly what happened here. You took away this girl's safety and peace of mind, and now you're going to have to answer for it." The policeman felt his breath catch. Fear gripped him like cold, clenched fingers. He realized that his career, his reputation, and even his freedom were in jeopardy. He never thought he could be in this situation, and it felt like a bad dream. "How could I have been so stupid?" he whispered, staring at the ground, lost. His whole life, his confidence, his worldview was shattering on the rocks of reality. He had watched his victim, a young girl, have a right to protection and safety ripped away from her, and now he himself was on the brink of destruction. The captain, feeling that his words were accomplishing their purpose, added, "You have to realize that justice cannot be selective. If you really want to become a better person, you need to recognize your mistakes and fight the bias within you. Otherwise, you will not only fail to protect others, but also yourself." The policeman finally met the captain's gaze. He didn't know what to do. His life had changed forever, and he realized that it no longer depended on him what would happen next. He was like a shadow, forever lost in the dark side of his soul, and his fear only grew stronger with every second. The captain, noticing his internal struggle, continued, "I don't want this to be the end of your career, but you have to decide for yourself. We can help you change, but you have to be willing to accept that help and admit your mistakes. You will have to learn to be the kind of police officers this community deserves." That policeman, feeling his heart clench with fear, realized that he no longer had a chance to escape responsibility. He could only hope that he would have the opportunity to change himself, but for now he was only a victim of his own preconceived beliefs. The next morning, there was an atmosphere of tension in the police station. The captain, confident that his actions and words were the right ones, began preparing documents for the official proceedings. He realized that this incident was an important step toward justice, not only for his daughter, but for anyone who has ever experienced bias and violence at the hands of law enforcement. That policeman, who had not yet regained his confidence, was in anticipation of his punishment. He knew that the process that would begin would be long and agonizing. His colleagues began to whisper behind his back, some with condemnation, others with regret. He had become an outcast in a world that at once seemed familiar and safe to him. The captain assembled a team to discuss the way forward. He was determined not only to protect his daughter, but also to change a system that often allowed incidents like this to happen with impunity. He knew that he now had the support of other employees who were also unhappy with what had happened. "We have to do this right," the captain said, looking at his colleagues. "We can't let actions like this go unchecked. These police officers broke the law, and we must let it be known that bias and violence have no place in our department." His words resonated with many, and gradually the atmosphere in the room began to change. Doubt and fear gave way to determination and a desire for justice. The captain knew that this would be a step toward more, toward showing the whole community that racism and abuse of power would not be tolerated. Meanwhile, the young girl who had survived that terrible night Saturday with her father in their home, she still felt vulnerable, but now there was hope in her heart. Her father put his arm around her, and together they discussed how important it was that her story be heard. They decided that they should do everything they could to let others know what had happened to warn against situations like this. "I want the other girls to know that they can talk and that their voice matters," she said, squeezing her father's hand. "I want them to feel safe." The captain nodded, realizing that his daughter had found a strength he hadn't even known she had. She had become a symbol of the fight for justice, and he had promised her that he would do everything he could to make sure that this kind of thing didn't happen again. At the police station, the process of investigation began. The police officers was summoned for questioning and was finally confronted with the reality of his actions. The captain presented the facts gathered during the investigation, supported by eyewitness accounts and evidence that pointed to the violation of the girl's rights. "You exceeded your authority and used your position to intimidate a defenseless man," said one of the high-ranking officers, looking at the policeman with distaste. "Your actions were inexcusable." With every word uttered, the policeman felt his world finally crumble. He realized that this moment would be the turning point in his life. The stares of his colleagues were full of condemnation, and it came as a shocking revelation to him. All his pride and confidence was shattered. The next day, when all the facts were presented, the girl's captain issued a statement to the public confirming that justice had been served. He said that the police officers had been suspended from duty and his actions would be investigated in a criminal case. "We must do everything we can to restore public confidence in law enforcement," the captain said, looking into the camera. "Our job is to protect, not intimidate. We cannot allow bias and racism to remain in our system." His words were greeted with great applause, and the young girl, looking at the screen, felt her heart fill with pride. It was the moment when she realized that her voice, though quiet, had been heard and justice had been done. On this day, downtown, More than just an office proceeding happened. There was a change that inspired many. The community began to realize that their voices mattered and that they could be a force to change the world around them. The girl hugged her father, and a sense of victory burned in their eyes. They knew there would be more work ahead, but they were ready for it. They stood on the threshold of a new era, where justice and fairness would be fundamental principles, and bias and violence would not go unpunished. The morning sun was shining, dispelling the shadows of the night as the young girl and her father stood in front of the police headquarters. Around them, many people were gathered, ready to support them, speaking out against injustice and calling for change. They didn't know what was in store for them, but they knew one thing. This was not just their personal triumph, but a step toward changing society. The captain, who had recently been just a father, had now become a symbol of the struggle for equality and justice. He realized that a cause that began with a single story had become a movement that sought to break the shackles of prejudice and racism. Sitting in his office, he remembered how his daughter, small and vulnerable, had become the embodiment of the strength this world demands. "This is just the beginning," he said, addressing his colleagues. "We must rethink our role as authorities. We must become protectors, not oppressors. Each of us is responsible for what happens in our society." Amid these words, the people in the room began to nod, realizing that change was necessary. The fear and uncertainty that had once gripped them now became fuel for action. But even with this newfound courage, the captain knew the journey would be long and difficult. The young girl, clutching her father's hand, realized that the struggle for equality and justice was not yet over. She thought of those who did not have the opportunity to speak out against the system, of those who could not defend themselves. Inside her grew a desire to act, not just for herself, but for others who might face similar difficulties in the future. "I want them to know that we are not alone," she said, glancing at the crowd, "that there are many of us, and we can change this system. We must fight for those who cannot speak." The captain nodded, proud of his daughter. He knew those words were important, and they reflected a truth they both understood. Justice is not just about results. It is a path to walk together, supporting each other. At that moment, one of the officers with whom the captain had previously worked approached them. He was among those worried about his colleagues' actions, and his face reflected the changes taking place in the heart of the police department. "We are ready to support you," he said, looking into the eyes of the captain and his daughter. "We know we need to change, and we want to help you do that." The captain and his daughter exchanged glances. It was the moment when they realized that change begins not only with the supreme power, but also with ordinary people willing to fight for justice. Every action, every word, every movement makes a difference. As the day drew to a close and the sun's rays began to stretch toward the horizon, the girl looked at her father and said, "We did it, Dad, but this is just the beginning. We have to keep going." The captain, as he hugged her, felt his heart fill with hope. He knew there were many obstacles ahead of them, but they were ready to fight. Their actions were part of a larger struggle for justice, and now they realized that every step, no matter how small, made a huge difference. This is how the story ended, but it left a mark in the hearts of those who heard it. This fight for equality and justice is not over, and they all knew that their voices had power. This is not just a story. It is the beginning of a movement in which everyone has the right to be heard, and justice is not just a word, but an ideal to strive for. The sun was shining, but they knew there were many more dark nights ahead of them. Still, with each new battle, with each new voice that rose up against prejudice, they came closer to that light that had once seemed out of reach. And this story, which they recalled so often, became their guiding star in the struggle for a better future. Thank you for being with us. We're interested in hearing what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Your stories are important, and discussing them can help raise awareness and promote understanding. Each of you is very important to us, and we sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other important stories. We wish you a wonderful day.